I'm Michael Hibblen. Welcome to this discussion on the Six Bridges Book Festival. I'm news director of KUAR Public Radio in Little Rock, joined by the authors of two fascinating books, both nonfiction and both a mix of Victorian era medicine and true crime. One focuses on a physician who was also a serial killer. The other looks at what is today considered a pseudoscience, but in the 1800s was a serious part of crime and punishment. I hope our viewers will take part. I welcome your questions. If you're joining us via Zoom, you can ask questions. You can find a box at the bottom or to the right. And you'll also find links to the authors' websites, learn more about how to get their books. But I'll start by introducing both of them. And I think the way we're going to split this up is first focus on Dean Jobb. He is the author of The Case of the Murderous Dr. Cream, The Hunt for a Victorian Era Serial Killer, which was published by Algonquin Books. He's an award-winning author and journalist, as well as a professor at the University of King's College in Halifax, Nova Scotia, where he teaches in the Master of Fine Arts in Creative Nonfiction program. The book has been longlisted for the American Library Association's 2002 Andrew Carnegie Medal for Excellence in Nonfiction. It's also a finalist for the Chicago Writer Association's Nonfiction Book of the Year. Dr. Jobb is also the author of 8 previous books. Dean Jobb, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much, Michael.
Dr. Courtney Thompson is the author of An Organ of Murder, Crime, Violence, and Phrenology in the 19th Century America. And Dr. Thompson, hello. Great to have you both with us here. I'll start with you, Mr. Jobb. First, tell me about, before we have you do a reading of your book, tell me a little bit about Dr. Cream. Not a very likable person,
And not a household name, which is surprising because he is one of the deadliest serial killers of the Victorian age, eclipsing Jack the Ripper and H.H. Holmes, who's the famous Chicago killer who was in The Devil in the White City. Cream killed at least 10 people, 9 of them women, in 3 countries. And I was drawn to the story by the fact that he he was able to get away with time after time, even when the victims were his patients, even when he was the prime suspect, and sometimes even when he was actually charged and taken to court. So I wanted to dive in and understand what were the failings? What was the state of policing? What was the state of forensic science? And what were the societal aspects or factors that led to this ability, the seeming inability to hold this man responsible for his crimes?
Yeah, he managed to keep going and keep killing for years. Well, if we could start, go ahead and read us a section of your book.
Okay, well, thanks. To set the scene, I mentioned that Dr. Cream had killed in 3 countries. He was a doctor who grew up in Canada and went to medical school in Montreal, McGill University. He killed his first 2 victims, both women, in Canada, escaped any kind of consequences, then practiced in Chicago for 2 or 3 years in the early 1880s, killed 3 women there, ultimately was convicted of killing the only man he murdered, went to prison for 10 years, managed to buy his way out of prison, and ultimately ends up in England, where he starts a rampage attacking sex workers in an area of London known as Lambeth. So the reading picks up very soon after he's arrived in Lambeth. He's already killed 8 people by this point, and his method of choice was strychnine, a deadly poison that he would add to medication, or in the latter crimes, to pills that he would concoct, and putting in a lethal dose of strychnine. So to set the scene, picture London in the time of Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson, perhaps as they're hailing a hansom cab on a sinister fog-shrouded night. And in this passage I'm going to read, Cream finally meets his match. A woman in her mid-20s waited beneath the Gothic facade of St. James Hall on Regent Street, just off Piccadilly Circus. Neatly trimmed brows arched above her large, lively eyes. Brown hair framed her delicate face. Light from gas street lamps danced and glistened on the wet pavement, scrubbed clean by days of heavy rain. A man in a black overcoat, a top hat perched on his bald head, touched her on the shoulder. A mustache softened his sharp features of his thin face, but what stood out were his eyes, steel gray and magnified by the thick lenses of his spectacles. They were crossed. No one would have described the man as handsome, but the woman had spotted the glint of a gold watch. This was a man of means. She had met him earlier that October night in 1891 at the nearby Alhambra Theatre of Varieties in Leicester Square, a massive Moorish-themed hall that could pack more than 4,000 into its galleries and standing room sections. But many of the men in the audience were not there for the shows. Scantily clad dancers returned backstage to find notes from admirers in the box seats, some making what were politely termed indecent proposals. Prostitutes circulated in the crowd and scanned the seats. The Alhambra's manager reckoned as many as 100 women of the town, as he called them, were in attendance on most nights. As long as they were well-dressed and discreet, like the woman who had set up the rendezvous on Regent Street, their presence was tolerated. The woman and the man in the top hat walked a half dozen blocks to the Paris Hotel in Soho, a seedy enclave on the edge of the theater district. He said he was a doctor at St. Thomas's across the river in Lambeth. This was not quite true. While he was a medical man, he had no affiliation with the hospital. What was her name? Lou Harvey, she said, short for Louisa. Thomas Neal Cream did not offer his name, and she never asked. In the morning, he paid her £3, more than she usually made in a week. They arranged to meet later that day, 7:30 on the Thames Embankment, near the Charing Cross railway station. He would take her to a show, her choice. She picked the Oxford Music Hall, one of the best and most popular in the city. As they parted, he made a strange remark. He said I had a few spots on my forehead, Harvey would recall. He said he would bring me some pills to take them away. He was waiting for her when she reached the riverside that evening. They walked to the nearby Northumberland Arms public house for a glass of wine. Then they strolled back to the river's edge, lined with hissing gas lamps that cast an eerie glow over the embankment. He reached into a pocket of his waistcoat and pulled out a wad of tissue paper. Inside were 2 long, oblong, light-colored capsules. Don't bite them, he told her. Swallow them as they are. He pressed them into the palm of her right hand. She lifted her hand to her mouth and seemed to swallow the pills. But he wanted to be sure. Show me your hand, he said. She did. It was empty. He asked to see her left hand. It too was empty. There was a change of plans, he suddenly announced. He had an appointment at the hospital, but she should go ahead to the music hall on her own. He would meet her outside, and then they would go back to the Paris Hotel for the night. He gave her 5 shillings for the cab fare. Meet me at 11, Cream said as he turned and walked towards Westminster Bridge in the direction of the hospital. Goodbye for the present. Harvey, wary of her generous new customer, had not taken the pills. Not liking the look of them, she would recall, I pretended to put them in my mouth. In the flickering gaslight, the doctor had not noticed as she passed them from hand to hand. When he looked away for a moment, she dropped them over the edge of the embankment. Hours later, at 11 o'clock, as arranged, Hervey emerged from the music hall. Cream was not there. She waited a half an hour, but he never showed up. Strange, she must have thought. It was as if he never expected her to keep their appointment.
Wow. And was she the only one who did not take the poison?
That's known, and she seems to be the only one who outfoxed him, and she'll become a very important witness later in the story. But there were a couple of other attempted murders on top of the 10 that I was able to identify that can be laid at his hands.
Yeah. I'll show a picture. You described him a little bit, but you get kind of the essence looking at him. And I'll show that again here. But
That's as
Dr.
a young,
Cream,
that's as a young man in medical school, but by all accounts, you could not cast a more perfect Victorian villain with his black overcoat or cape, his top hat, the crossed eyes. He even had one witness who knew him said sort of a fiendish cackle, like you'd expect. So he was very much every bit the Victorian villain.
what any indications what drove him to target sex workers? Obviously, he was uh, patronizing them, but why did this started? What might have been
He
a motivating factor for him?
Well, he targeted sex workers in London. Most of the women, well, all of the women who died in the 5 who died in North America were actually young women who were pregnant and unmarried and came to him because he offered the services. He would perform illegal abortions. By all accounts, he had a busy practice, but at some point he decided some of these women would live and some would die, and he started perfecting the amount of strychnine he'd use, how he'd give it to them. He told them this medicine would induce a miscarriage, and what it did is it killed them. Nothing in his background stands out. A privileged background from a wealthy family in Canada, money to send him to medical school, but was trapped into an early marriage because he got his fiancée pregnant, and he performed an illegal abortion that almost killed her, and then ultimately was able to send her medicine that killed her at the age of 24. And that seems to have set him on the path. And perhaps it was that feeling of being trapped, projecting that on other women. It's hard to say. He never pleaded insanity, so there was never a formal assessment to try to understand the real roots of this mania, this drive, because it was very much that he had a campaign to kill women, either women who were pregnant out of wedlock, or in the end, targeting sex workers.
You mentioned his privileged background. Was this part of how he managed to escape conviction several times, able to avoid uh, being under scrutiny?
Well, it certainly there was money from his family, at least initially, to fund his defense, because he stood trial for one of the murders of one of the women, and actually was acquitted. But what it did was, it was very much a matter of privilege. He was able to flex suspicion from himself because of his stature. He he didn't have to claim he had good medical credentials. He was from the best graduate of the best medical school in Canada. He was licensed by the College of Physicians and Surgeons in Edinburgh, and that was the sort of top designation in the world at the time. So he was eminently qualified, and he was able to use that to buy himself the time and space to, in some cases, skip town, or to be seen as above suspicion.
And part of what was striking too were these were excruciating deaths. Not you took poison and went to sleep, but these were very unpleasant deaths.
It's a mark of the evil in this man and the cruelty that, yeah, he picked strychnine. One expert in poison said, if you tried to guess what could be the worst poison, strychnine would be high on the list. Prolonged, painful convulsions and spasms that rack the person's body can take hours for ultimately heart failure to claim the victim's life. And chillingly, Cream, by putting this in medicine and instructing many of his victims to take the medicine before bed, was killing from afar. I say in the book that it was almost like he had a god complex, that he had devised this method to kill from afar, and that it's not like he wouldn't know what his victims were facing. As a medical man, he knew exactly what the effects of strychnine would be on his victims. So it's just another chilling aspect that whatever ghoulish pleasure he took in these crimes, he made sure he was off the scene and imagining what was happening.
What eventually led to a conviction in his case?
Well, it's a great question because of the fact that he evaded detection for so long, or conviction. But ultimately, it took Scotland Yard a long time to realize a serial killer. This is about 3 or 4 years after Jack the Ripper. So the Whitechapel crimes are very fresh in the minds of people in London. But Scotland Yard was slow to realize there was a serial killer in their midst. The first 2 murders Creams commits before he meets Lou Harvey and tries to kill her, one was chalked up to suicide, the other was chalked up to natural causes, even though it was very obvious that the drug had been administered, and in the second case that it was a strychnine death. That bought Cream some time. But ultimately, one of the things that tripped him up was another part of his MO, his modus operandi, was to write blackmail letters accusing very prominent people in London. An MP, a doctor to the royal family were some of his victims. He never collected the money, but it was like he needed to, through these letters, through pseudonyms he was using, tell the world how clever he was. And ultimately, he did make the mistake of writing some of those letters as handwriting, and that became instrumental in the police zeroing in on him and being able to amass the evidence to charge and take him to trial in London in 1892.
Yeah, and not long after his conviction, put to death. Describe the execution and the crowd that gathered uh, outside the prison walls.
Well, this is at an era, it's been decades, about 4 decades since hangings were public in Britain. But a crowd of some 5,000 showed up outside Newgate Prison, which is actually the site of the current Old Bailey courthouse. And even though they could see nothing, a rowdy crowd in a carnival mood showed up, and there were incredible descriptions of this mayhem. And even though it's early in the morning, there were a lot of people who were intoxicated, and the crowd, such was the cheers of the crowd and the noise, that it could be heard inside in the execution chamber. And then ultimately, to signal the fact that the execution had been carried out, a black flag was hoisted over Newgate, and that led to a celebration. So a ghoulish scene that's fitting for a ghoulish crime.
Yeah. And then some speculation about last words and suggestion. Maybe he's Jack the Ripper, but you write that's not likely.
Well, one way people might know Dr. Cream's name is he, for a long time, was on the long and sometimes I think even growing list of potential suspects in Jack the Ripper murders. And that really arises because they both targeted women. Many of the Ripper's victims, or some, were also sex workers. But the crimes were very different. And Cream has a very good alibi. He was in prison in Illinois at the time. But the speculation has all come out of a later, a decade after his execution. A short newspaper item claimed that his last words on the scaffold were, "I am Jack the," as if he was about to confess to being Jack the Ripper when the rope cut him off in mid-sentence. I think I show pretty conclusively in the book that this is an urban myth, what we call an urban myth now, but it took on a life of its own with some very bizarre conspiracy theories about doubles serving his term and him being able to escape prison early. But I conclusively say he wasn't Jack the Ripper.
Yeah. One nice transition, I think, here to Dr. Thompson's book. You mentioned on page 99 that phrenologists wanted to study his skull. Describe that.
Well, there was a file. There's a file opened whenever there's a death sentence because of the possibility that the government might intervene, commute the sentence, or grant a pardon even. And so the file, as I was going through the file in the London archives, there was a letter from phrenologists in London asking. They didn't want olive cream; they just wanted his head after he was executed. And but Jeffrey Lushington, I've never forgotten the name of this official of the Home Office, actually dismissed it to his minister. And no offense, Dr. Thompson, but he called them quacks. And the request ended there. But it does make a nice segue into the next book.
Yeah, Dr. Thompson, to bring you in on this. By the time this, in the 1890s, phrenology was, I guess, had pretty well been dismissed by that time. But was there, what was the interest by this point in time? And we could dig back in.
To a certain extent. So phrenology, which for those of you who might not be familiar, is the 19th century science of assessing the character and the mind based on the external portions of the skull, right? So basically it's a form of early cerebral localization. What they were trying to do was understand various aspects of the mind, things that we might think of as personality, other aspects like intelligence. But because you couldn't crack open somebody's head and look at their brain, and we didn't have MRI machines, the best way to get a sense of this correlation between the brain and the character was to examine the skull. So that's what the science is in sum. Certainly by the time we get to the 1890s, phrenology is really falling off the map. Phrenologists don't think so, incidentally. There was still a very robust phrenological community within the United States. There's also still a robust phrenological community in Britain. Actually, I've looked at records of membership of the British Phrenological Association. They still had quite a lot of members through the 1930s and 1940s even. So it has a certain longevity that would be surprising. But I'm not surprised that they wanted Dr. Cream's head, because the heads of murderers, whether we're talking about the skull itself, we're talking about a cast of the head, or viewing the criminal, him or herself, in person and examining their head, that was one of the most key aspects of phrenological practice in the 19th century. It was one of the things that helped to establish the science, that helped to make it get taken very seriously in its early days, but it also became a key component to the continued spread of phrenology within both science, law, medicine, and within the broader public.
Yeah, and I'll just show a quick photo here of one of the few of Dr. Cream there without his top hat on.
Yes.
Any assessment you could make taking a look.
It's funny. I get asked all the time to phrenologize. I was actually once invited to a festival where they wanted a phrenologist to appear, and I said, I don't do that exactly. But after studying enough of this, you do start to get a sense of some of the big picture ideas. And one of the big picture ideas, literally big picture ideas in phrenology, was this notion of what I refer to as, or what's referred to in the book as the organ of destructiveness, but originally named the organ of murder, which, if everybody wants to take their fingers sitting at home, if you want to feel the area right above your ears, that is where your organ of destructiveness also known as the organ of murder, is located. So you can see if you have it. And in the 19th century, there were lots of illustrations like this one. I think, sorry, I can't really, there we go, which showed basically small destructiveness and large destructiveness. And the large destructiveness illustration, if we notice, it isn't just one organ that sort of bumps out. It's the entire side of the head. It makes the head wide, sort of narrow over the crown, which would be where the various characteristics of mind would restrain bad impulses. But that wideness over the ears was usually seen as an indicator of all sorts of bad behavior, not just murder.
A reminder for our viewers, we do welcome your questions. Feel free to add them, and we'd certainly love for you to be part of the discussion. Dr. Thompson, where did this phrenology really come from? How did this begin?
So phrenology originally was developed by German scientists, physicians, and anatomists, chiefly Franz Josef Gall, who is a German physician and anatomist, and his assistant, Johann Gaspar Spurzheim, who originally basically joins on with Gall as his dissectionist, as the man responsible for doing the dissections on dead bodies that he used for his research. So right around the turn of the 19th century, between the late 1790s, around 1804, 1805, Gall and eventually Spurzheim engaged in a lot of studies of the brain and the skull. And a lot of these studies are done in prison. So in fact, the organ of murder, destructiveness, is actually one of the very first organs, the first examples of cerebral localization that was key to this system. Now, Gall didn't refer to it as phrenology. The term phrenology came later. But as Gall's knowledge spread throughout Europe, and as he himself and eventually Spurzheim traveled through Europe, then through the United Kingdom, Spurzheim goes to the United Kingdom, they spread knowledge about this new science, which is called by various names in this period. And at least initially, it's taken very, very seriously. Gall was a very well-respected physician and anatomist, as was Spurzheim. They were trained in very traditional matters, and phrenology fit in with a lot of broader scientific and medical theories of the day. So that first decade or so of the first decades of the 19th century, phrenology looked like a very legitimate science because it was a legitimate science. It was a legitimate science that was practiced by legitimate scientists. It doesn't become a popular science, sort of akin to fortune telling, until we get much later into the century. Scientists and physicians start to abandon the science in the 1840s, mostly because there's new research in cerebral localization that basically disproves the notion of cerebral localization, at least for then. They come back to it again in the 1860s. But by then, phrenology has become a popular science, especially here in the United States. And it had become sort of, I don't want to say low class, but it was definitely not associated with elite halls of science anymore. But there was this interesting moment in the first few decades of the 19th century, and especially here in the United States, where all sorts of different experts, professors at places like Harvard and Yale, the actual president of Yale, scientists, physicians, judges, psychiatrists, lawyers, all took phrenology very seriously. And they tried to apply it to their own realms of influence. And that, and what I argue in the book, is it is those early uses of phrenology, when you have all these different kinds of people who see phrenology and they think, aha, here might be a scientific solution to a bunch of problems that we have, especially social problems and especially crime. And that's what allowed phrenology to really spread through the halls of law and medicine, through prisons and through society in ways that I would suggest still continue to shape the way we think about crime today.
Yeah, kind of the hope of just being able to look at someone and make a decision about whether or not this person, this unknown person maybe walking down the street toward you is good or a killer.
Yes, that was absolutely. It was very much motivated that part of the spread. So we can think of it as two things. First, you have this problem of crime, among other problems, poverty, mental illness, and so forth, where phrenology is really the first science to step forward and offer a theory of crime. It's effectively the first criminal science in a lot of ways because it offers a scientific explanation for why bad people do bad things, right? And that's very useful, or it's seen as potentially useful in realms like medical jurisprudence. How do we determine if a criminal is insane or not? In penology, how can we reform criminals? But also in daily life. Keep in mind that mid-century America was experiencing rampant urbanization and industrialization. Cities were becoming worlds of strangers. And there were a lot of fears among Americans of all classes, of all characteristics about this influx of strangers. How can you trust the people that you walk by on the street every day? So while a lot of aspects of phrenology that people focus on the sort of inward directed aspects, the self-help kind of parts, and those matter too. What's equally important is the anxiety that also drove regular Americans to the phrenologist's office, because they were concerned about themselves, sure, but they were also concerned about the strangers that surrounded them every day.
Yeah, I guess going from a culture where people were in small
Mhm.
communities, knew everybody their whole lives, and yeah, suddenly you're in big cities and all these strangers, and how can you tell
Mhm.
who's walking toward you? Well, back to Dr. Gall, you write about him. I believe the brain was made up of 27 individual organs that determined personality. Describe that a little more, and how, what exactly it was in the brain, and how
Mhm.
he felt that worked.
So let me see if I can find, here. So this is a phrenological head. I think we can all see this here. And the way that phrenological theory worked, as I said, was a form of cerebral localization. But again, they can't peek into the brain. So what they have to do is try to figure out what the brain might look like based on the skull that encases it. So some of this sort of big picture ideas. So you have the idea that the bigger the brain, the smarter the person, perhaps, right? That one ends up being problematic for all sorts of reasons, but that was a common tenet within phrenology. But all of these different areas, and I don't know if you can, the resolution on my camera isn't good enough, unfortunately, to see all the different areas. But different regions and different individual areas on the skull were seen as, again, associating with the brain, but then also associating with some aspect of mind. So we get along the front, for example, all of these various organs have to do with what we would probably refer to as intelligence or reason. Along the crown of the head, you would have all of the sort of aspects of morality. This region over here, the animal organs, that's where you get the tendencies to fight and steal and kill, right? Like animals. And then the back, we have things like emotiveness, the ability to love, philoprogenitiveness, the love of children, love of family, inhabitiveness, the love of home. You might imagine that because of this sort of lump on the back, a true woman, and especially a good mother, would have a pretty prodigious back of her head to have all of those good motherly qualities.
Yeah. I promised to let you read a section of your book, and I forgot to do that. Do you have a section you'd like to read for us?
Yes, I've been flipping around. So I think to come back to the point that you raised, right, about this sort of danger, as well as this hope, this excitement of the possibility of being able to identify bad behavior before the act, I'm going to read you a short section, hopefully fairly short, about phrenological detective stories, which become popular in the 19th century and actually predate, in many cases, the stories of Sherlock Holmes. So this is not just part of the story of phrenology, but also we can see how phrenology helped to shape things like the detective story itself. So I will begin. Over the course of the century, fictionalized accounts of the science appeared in newspapers and other periodicals, many of which framed phrenology as an object of mockery or derision. Focusing on the science of bumpology and presenting its practitioners as buffoons or even ill-intentioned frauds and fakes, such stories tried to delegitimize the science and frame its believers and practitioners alike as fools. Like attempts to fool or hoax the phrenologist by presenting him with an anonymous skull, these tales sought to undermine the legitimacy and the authority of the science. Some of these phrenologists were simply buffoons, with or without their science. One story described a, quote, drunken philosophical phrenological loafer who preached a mixed up version of phrenology while in his cups. Another drunken phrenologist imprisoned in a local jail for intoxication protested that the charge was unfair as, quote, I was intoxicated, drunk, delirious, sir, but it was not with alcohol. It is the effect of those copious libations which I have quaffed at the fountain of science. Sometimes the humorous anecdote even conveyed a grain of phrenological truth. Quote, a phrenologist told a man he had combativeness largely developed. No, said the other, I have not. And if you say that again, I'll knock you down. However, other fictional phrenologists were heroic, deftly able to make sense of human behavior. On the heels of Edgar Allan Poe's invention of Auguste Dupin in The Murders of the Rue Morgue, and decades before Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes stories, practical phrenology promoted its own genre of detective story in defense of its claims to legitimacy. Phrenological detective stories were part of an emerging genre responding to social conditions, transformations in the literary market and journalism, and anxieties about law, crime, and human nature in the Anglo-American world. Stories that fit within this genre of writing framed phrenology as a predictive science of criminal behavior. Phrenologists could identify wrongdoers even before the act. While some phrenological detective stories appeared in popular newspapers, most were published in the American Phrenological Journal and were likely written by phrenological partisans. An incident in the travels of a phrenologist, for example, was widely republished in American newspapers. The story was told in the first person from the point of view of a phrenologist who recalled a trip through the Alps in the 1820s, during which time he performed a reading on a surpassingly beautiful young woman at the request of her mother. Quote, we were alone, science and nature, he observed, but hardly had I encircled her head when my heart shuddered. Crime, remorseless, deliberate, unfeeling crime, crime unprovoked, unbridled, unhesitating, cold, resolute crime reigned supreme in her head. He concluded that, quote, never had I witnessed contrast more dreadful, the face and the head. The phrenologist warned his client never to marry as, quote, there is no affection. You are impelled by violence. If your iron will is thwarted, destructiveness, and that is our organ of murder, will become active. When he spoke the word destructiveness, the young woman cried out in despair and fled, revealing as she left that she was about to marry a wealthy man. And the story ended with a coda. Months later, the phrenologist was informed that a recently married young lady had stabbed her husband and absconded with another rich man. And unsurprisingly, this murderess was the same young woman examined by the phrenologist. Other stories circulated which played on similar themes and replicated this plot. A phrenologist encountered an individual and observed their criminal tendencies via their organs, findings which were confirmed in the revelation of a great crime. The discovery of thieves was one common plot. In one story, a phrenologist, Monsieur Barreau, attended a dinner party during which he was invited by his host to examine his guests' heads. He stated that the head of one guest had, quote, the organ for theft frightfully large. The accused thief fled the party, and the other members of the party recalled a series of thievish misdemeanors. The final line of this story suggested that the man, quote, yielded to an instinct which a good education had entirely failed to cure, reinforcing the idea that some heads were simply bad.
Wow. Amazing. A question for both of you. Elizabeth Whitten asks, in the course of researching both of your books, how far away did you have to travel to access archives? Both of you, had books from, the 1800s. What's the process of getting at the original or raw materials? And I'll start with you. Dean Jobb.
Okay. It depends. I mean, in my case, I have someone who killed in 3 countries, 2 continents. So I followed his trail. So through Quebec and Ontario, Canada, into Chicago and a city, Belvedere in northern Illinois, and then to London. And the records, amazingly, in some cases, are still in the original courthouses. They have never moved. Often they are passed over to archives. But I don't know what Courtney's experience has been, but I certainly was able to straddle the pandemic. I was in writing mode by the time the pandemic hit. Otherwise, it would have been very difficult to do this travel. And it's really a second best to get a researcher to go in. I want to handle this material myself and also visit any areas where my characters were, where crimes were committed, just to see what's still there.
Yeah. The pandemic has certainly really changed research in a lot of ways. Fortunately, we do live in an era of digitization, and a lot of archives are very generous in making it possible to get digitized records, although of course it's not the same as being there in person. Well, when I originally thought I was going to write a story about France, and so I actually went to France. It was one of my earliest research trips, but there is no French history in this book. So I spent a lot of time going through the United States, a bunch of archives in New York, in Boston, down to North Carolina. I did some work at Duke, UCLA, so in California. But the thing about phrenology that's interesting is almost every archive has some phrenological documents, but it's never a lot of stuff all in one place, or there's only a few places. UCLA has a huge phrenological collection, for example. So I did a lot of writing saying, you have one letter, you have one document. And at the time when I did most of the research for this, I was a grad student. So I'd say, I do not have a lot of money. What, is there any way I could get access to this one document? And luckily there's a lot of wonderful, generous people. So there's materials in here from the UK, from Edinburgh in particular, from small archives in places like Maine, Ohio, really through the generosity of various archives and museums, for which I'm very grateful.
And Dr. Thompson, Natasha Graff asks, what did your research about phrenology say about intelligence?
The intelligence question is a really good one because there was a lot of fascination with the question of intelligence in the 19th century. A lot of the way that we think about intelligence is based on things like the intelligence quotient, which is a latter century development that actually comes out of eugenics. But even before eugenics, there's a lot of fascination with men of genius, great men, and intelligence. Generally speaking, there were a lot of different people studying the skull in the late 18th century and the 19th century. We have our phrenologists, but we also have groups of figures who we can refer to as racial scientists and sexual scientists. And intelligence was a very crucial research question for scientists who are trying to define the differences between men and women and between different racial groups. And we can imagine that what they mostly concluded was that men are more intelligent than women and have more potential for various kinds of things, and that people of European descent are more intelligent and have more potential and aptitude than other racial groups. So intelligence is a question that doesn't seem very loaded, but it really is, because it had so much to do with race, assumptions about racial hierarchies, about gender and sex. And phrenology largely took up a lot of these ideas and just sort of reproduced them wholesale. Racial hierarchies are rife within phrenology, a lot of sexist assumptions as well about aptitudes of men and women. And that is despite the fact that phrenology was actually something that a lot of women practiced. There were female phrenologists, including Lydia Folger Fowler, who was the second woman in the United States to get a medical degree, was also a practicing phrenologist and wrote quite a lot about phrenology. So intelligence doesn't seem like a hot topic, a hot button sort of issue, but in the 19th century, pretty much all studies of the skull started from that simple premise that even before we get to notions of cerebral localization, there are some people who have more potential than others. And usually the people that were deemed to have the most potential were men of European descent.
Yeah, and I'll get to another question in a moment, but you mentioned men of European descent.
Yes.
Also, racist stereotypes about people of African descent.
Very, yes.
Yeah, talk about the descriptions. How were people from Africa? What was it for them that made these broad assumptions?
Yes, so there were, we have to keep in mind the context, of course. In the 19th century, when you have scientists, white scientists, especially white scientists in the United States, making arguments about, say, for example, and I'm replicating some of their language, these are not things I believe myself, about, for example, the essential savagery of indigenous Americans or the inherent servility of people of African descent, and finding evidence for these things on the skull, on the brain, whether they were phrenologists or anthropologists. Early anthropology was, especially as practiced here in the United States, was entirely wrapped up in defining differences between racial groups and reinforcing these hierarchies. What you then have is this sort of mutually reinforcing system where skulls are studied to find proof of, again, say, the savagery of indigenous people, the servility of people of African descent, which is then used as further justification for then current practices in the 19th century, including the violent enforced removal of indigenous people who are basically deemed to be unworthy of their land, in need of civilization, and at the same time, these same theories and ideas were also used to continually justify continued practices of enslavement. Now, there's a real irony here because a lot of phrenologists were actually fairly liberal for their day. They were very involved in reform efforts, educational reform, women's dress reform, things like temperance, water cure, and abolition. So figures like George Combe, who was a Scottish phrenologist, the Fowler brothers, who were American phrenologists, actually wrote quite a lot about how bad slavery was. They were very supportive of abolition. And yet at the same time, their publications also reproduced these racist notions and hierarchies. Combe very famously, and in my normal book talk, I put this quote up on the thing because it's so remarkable. Combe wrote extensively about how distasteful he found slavery, and yet basically argued that based on the skull of people of African descent, the only status they were suited for was that of slavery. So there's a lot of sort of, I tell my students when I teach the history of science, science is never pure, right? It is always reflective of the time and place in which it was produced and the values of the people who are producing it. And the tension within phrenology about saying one thing but doing another is very present in writings about race and writings about crime as well.
Yeah. A question to both of you, and this was something that just naturally popped in my head as well as I was reading this. But how did each of you choose your topics, and how long did it take each of you to write this? Mr. Job?
Um, I think in a way, someone like Cream chooses me, but I'm on the lookout for someone like him. And what I'm looking for is an interesting story, obviously, but I'm also looking for something beyond true crime and beyond the details of the crime. I'm looking for a story, a crime, an offender that really says a lot about the era, and that's what drew me to Cream. And I was obviously you can't write a story about a serial killer that doesn't have a lot of murders in it, but I wanted it to be more than a succession of murders. And that led to my organizing question, or which is the subtitle, The Hunt for Victorian Era Serial Killer. How did he get away with it? Where were the mistakes, the miscues, the missed opportunities, and just where were the failings of police enforcement, crime enforcement, and the limits of forensic science, the kind of things that would rein him in. So that's really how I found his story. Took me about 4 years, 4.5 years to research and write as well as teach. So a bit of a time commitment, but it was a big story, and the travel alone
Yeah.
was time consuming.
Yeah. Dr. Thompson, I think you wrote that this started out as a dissertation for you.
Yes, that's right. And I don't have the experience of Mr. Job with 8 books. I am an amateur in this particular instance. This is my first book. So the process is really you write a book and then you write it again. This started as a dissertation project. I suppose I started working on it in earnest in about 2013. I finished my degree in 2015. And I basically, after I finished my dissertation, the original draft, I needed a break from it. So I took a break from it for a while and basically started over again in around 2016, 2017. I went to some new archives. I went up to the New York Academy of Medicine for a summer to do a lot of work there. They were very generous in funding me. And I took out a lot of things I had done. I did a lot of new research. I wrote brand new chapters for it from what it had looked like. And I finished the full manuscript about 2 years ago. It's a different process in academic presses because you have to go through first one round of review, then you wait about 6 months, and then you do revisions, then you send it out again, and then they do more review. And then you go through the actual production parts where you do proofreading and indexing and all of that. So it sounds pretty sad, but this was almost 10 years of my life. I hope the next one is a shorter process. I dearly would love to get to the 4-year parameters. That sounds wonderful. So now I have a goal to shoot for.
We've got a few minutes left, so any other questions are welcomed. But how did phrenology really come to be discredited? And I guess we had later sciences that came in, and you began to understand more about mental illness. But how did this become discredited?
Well, a few different sort of converging things happen right at the end of the 1830s and the beginning of the 1840s. On the one hand, in Europe, especially in France, there's a cohort of scientists, anatomists, mostly led by a fellow by the name of, very long French name, but his last name is Fleuret, who did a bunch of anatomical research to disprove cerebral localization. And what you have to know about this and why it's important is that in the early part of the 19th century, French medicine, French anatomy, French pathology were seen as sort of the ne plus ultra. That was the hot science. So if the French scientists said, this doesn't work, then American scientists and physicians are really going to follow that lead in the 19th century. At the very same time that is happening in France, so you have these critiques coming from within science, this is the same moment when phrenology becomes popular. So our phrenologists of the 1820s, 1830s, they really didn't, they thought, yes, we should educate the public, but they didn't believe in things like reading heads for a fee, traveling phrenologists. They thought that phrenology was serious business. It was for serious people in serious places doing serious things. So the idea of the phrenologist who reads ahead for a fee, who gives public lectures, who sells phrenological tchotchkes, this was very much a big no-no. So at the very same time that you have these experts basically denouncing phrenological theory, and by this point, Spurzheim and Gall had both passed away as well. That matters too, right? They weren't around to defend themselves. You have practical phrenologists led in particular by the model of the Fowler brothers, who mostly operate out of New York City, who start to take on these big tours and who would sell readings for a fee and who would sell casts of busts and who started publishing popular periodicals. When I say popular, I mean very popular. The American Phrenological Journal at its height had 20,000 subscribers, which probably doesn't sound like a lot to us, but it was quite a lot in the 1840s, in the 1850s. So elite science basically looks at these circumstances and they say, the really fancy scientists think phrenology is bad, and now we have all these practical phrenologists ruining it. We're done, right? And they drop it, more or less. But the thing is, they don't really drop it because they still make use of its ideas, its languages, its image in all sorts of ways throughout the rest of the century. They just don't refer to it as phrenology anymore.
Does phrenology have much of an existence anymore, even as a novelty?
I would argue we absolutely still live in a world that's very much shaped by phrenology. Think, for example, a few things I'll bring up. After the Capitol insurrection, just Just last year in January, after the fact, Ronan Farrow at the New Yorker interviewed a man who was one of the insurrectionists who said in the interview that he was a phrenologist, he was a phrenological adherent. So people still actually identify with phrenology today. But more insidious, I think, are the ways in which it continues to shape many aspects of daily life. Consider, for example, the last time you watched a children's cartoon, a Disney movie. What do bad guys look like? What do good guys look like? What head shapes signal somebody is bad or good? And consider as well that there is a lot of money right now in things like AI facial recognition, as well as things like fMRI studies that are basically replicating the exact same findings, of our good and bad head from the 19th century. Images like this are being recreated by AI that purport to be able to predict bad behavior before the act. And this is without getting into the ways in which phrenological language is literally enshrined in the way that we define, for example, criminal insanity. Who is criminally insane in this country? So I would suggest that there are certainly, you can go to Urban Outfitters or go on Etsy and you can buy a phrenological bust. I have a whole collection of them at this point because people keep giving them to me. You can buy phrenological tchotchkes. You can have people at the Capitol calling themselves phrenologists. But what I think is actually much more concerning and much more interesting is the ways in which we use phrenology all the time and how we make judgments about the people around us in the media that we consume and potentially in the AI that will surveil us going forward.
Yeah. Harriet Powell writes, what are each of you working on? Are y'all working on your next books? Start with you, Dean Jobb.
Yes, that's always a great question that comes up when you're touring one book. And the reality, as Courtney said, is these books were done a couple of years ago. So I'm happy to say that, yeah, I'm now researching and writing a new book set in the Jazz Age about a gentleman jewel thief, and it says a lot about. It's another one of these stories I like because it says a lot about the times. It says a lot about the excesses and wealth and anything goes attitude of the decade, and makes for a really good story, I hope.
Yeah.
That sounds fantastic. I mean, all of your books sound like they could be movies or TV series, a prestige film on, prestige miniseries on HBO. I'd watch that. Dr. Cream, the hunt for Dr. Cream. How great would that be, right?
Well, and after tonight, I'm never going to look at these characters, never going to look at their photos the same way.
It gets in your head. I'm telling you, like,
Yes,
I can't,
it does, yeah.
I'm a big fan of crime dramas, and I every time they say something, I sit up and I'm like, there it is. They just did it. They did the thing. I'm currently working on a project that has nothing to do with phrenology, which is very exciting because, as I said, after you spend almost 10 years of your life doing something, you're ready for something else. So my next book actually did kind of fall into my lap when I came here at Mississippi State as a new faculty member. They had just acquired the records, the archive of a Southern physician who is a really interesting guy. If you like a good story, Dean, I think you'll like this one. He starts in rural Mississippi. He works as a physician down here. He eventually goes to a reservation in the West. He goes through New York. He comes back and sets up shop in Memphis. He had a really interesting life, but what's really useful about him is he was sort of like a Forrest Gump, right? He traveled through these really interesting spaces. He tells us, so he's not going to be the only character in the book, but I'm using him as a starting point to think about the late part of the 19th century and experiences of medicine, especially the experiences of people of color, Indigenous Americans, women. He also works with, for example, two-spirit individuals when he's on the reservation. So again, he interacts with a lot of different kinds of people, and how, as a white Southerner who is the son of a Confederate colonel whose family had been enslavers, how his and that of other physicians like him, how they moved through this post-Reconstruction context. In particular, what kind of emotions doctors felt about their patients as they worked with different kinds of patients in different places. I'm excited about it. It's a very different thing, which is great. So the allure of the new, certainly.
Yeah. Well, we're pretty much out of time, but just want to remind our viewers that the books are available to be purchased. Six Bridges Book Festival Square site and Wordsworth Books on our street in the Heights here in Little Rock also has the books available for pickup. Great conversations. I really enjoyed it. Fascinating stories. So thank you both for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you guys so much.
And thanks to everyone who has watched this. And the Six Bridges Book Festival continues. A lot more great discussions to come over the 11-day festival. So thanks so much. I'm Michael Hibblen, and it's been a real treat.
Dean, it was nice to meet you and hear
nice.
about your book.
Well, nice to meet you too. And I've got your book.
Oh, I don't have a copy of yours. I'm so sorry, but
Here,
it sounds wonderful. I'm going to
take-
have to read it. I know. It sounds right up my alley. So I look forward to reading it, and I can't wait to hear about this jewel thief in the future.
Yeah, well, thanks. I almost said we should swap books because that's a fascinating book you've got too.
Yeah.
But I think we look for the same thing. You're looking for that story that's more than just, that has legs, I guess, for want of a better word.
Yeah,
I mean, journalism. So that's my thinking about it anyway.
Absolutely. I mean, I think historians are storytellers at their heart. And if you can't tell a good story, then you're missing out on at least half the fun, right?
Yeah.
I'm really excited because the first chapter of this new book, I feel like you'll appreciate this, and then I'll we should probably both go and eat dinner. But so the first chapter of this book is about Holder, and it's based on his diaries from when he was a student. And I found another student who basically they both went to college and then medical school at the same time, right? So they're both living in the South. They're both going to medical school. Holder's kind of buttoned up. He's like into temperance. He whines a lot. Holder's my main physician guy, right? The other guy, though, his diary was partially in code, and I got to actually crack the code to figure out what else he was writing about. And he, the uncoded parts of his diary are very mundane and boring. And then the other parts of his diary, he's drinking all the time. He is smoking weed. He is off going to brothels. Like he's doing everything you can do in the 19th century. He is up to, and it's just such a fun. I think of them as like Goofus and Gallant. You have like your really well behaved type, but then you have your and it was such a fun chapter to write. It came together in just a few days because when you have the story, it tells itself really.
Yeah.
So. Anyway,
it's funny.
Sorry to keep you, but
I'm having the same experience. I usually do most of my research before I ever start writing anything substantial or and I've already written the prologue and the first chapter of this book. Just because, again, I think there is something to be said for when the material is really rich and you're engaged. Yeah, it just starts flowing. So anyway, good to meet you.
Good to meet you, and best of luck with the next one. Take care, and thank you, Michael, for moderating.
Thank you, Michael.
Yeah. No,
and
great.
Andre.
Great
Yes,
conversation.
thank you, Andre.
I really enjoyed it. Thank you, Andre.
Take care, everybody.
Okay.
Bye.
Okay, bye.